will please walk carefully so that we don't have any spillage. We will replace a couple that have been spilled. Okay?
840. I mean, 830 at Sheraton Hotel, right at the center of the convention center. Yeah, room 830. That will be fine. I am asked to sum up.
We did. All right, so let me take this opportunity to actually thank some of our sponsors here. We have Nishant, if you can stand up here from ICICI Bank. ICICI is our silver sponsor. So thank you, Nishant and team. I know, we work with our Odisha NRI banking as well, and it's headed by Pradosh. And Pradosh has been extremely helpful, cooperative with us. All of us look forward to actually have a wonderful relationship with ICICI, and thanks for joining us. All right, so next we have Snehal from Indus. So Snehal, thank you again for the association. Hopefully it's a long one, long cherished one. Snehal, you have an organization which does trust planning. You help with startups, a number of things you do. So maybe just 30 seconds to all of us here.
I think, so I'm Snehal Patil, founder, CEO of Indus Counsel, a Silicon Valley law firm. Morning I spoke about entrepreneurship, startups, etc. But very quickly I'll dwell on the other side of my practice, which is creating wills and trusts. So essentially helping individuals and families conserve their wealth and transfer it without any court process to the next generation, what we say, creating a trust, wills, guardianship, right? So all of that we take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nishant Malhotra and I am part of ICICI Bank. We are now present in Sunnyvale. We cater to both NRIs and corporates who are in link with India. If they have any requirement with banking in India, we can help them from our office in Sunnyvale. So look forward to connecting with you guys. Thank you.
And then last we have here Sagar from Z5. So Sagar, thanks a lot for coming here. I know when we started discussing with Z5 as our digital content platforms, I think there was a lot of interest. So Z5 also actually started in US in June 22, 2021, right? So since then, I think they've come a long way. I think that there's a wide variety of wonderful programs they have now. And the good news is, like for OSA convention, we have a specific code. If you use that, we get like 1 month of free subscription. So thank you again for that opportunity. So I know like with Z5, we'll continue to stay in touch with all the rest of the programs through the year. Thank you, Sagar, for being with us. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Connections that I take pride on. Professor Andy Waterhouse is the leading wine chemist of the world. He's currently the director of the Robert Mondavi Institute at UC Davis. And and this will be a surprise for you, Andy, that I would like to also congratulate Andy. This is his first day after retirement. And personally, both Andy and I will take a great pride in introducing Priyanka, her French. She graduated from UC Davis and she is the first female Indian winemaker in Napa Valley. That's a double pride in here as our alum. She is a former graduate of UC Davis. Is she your student? Oh, okay. Yeah. And also, as I said, the Indian communities is pride for us. So thank you very much for willing to, and remember this is a long weekend. they had to do a lot of sacrifice for their plans in order to join us and give us this wonderful trade. So with that, I will hand it over to this team and they will take us through this adventure.
Don't start drinking yet. So one of the things I would like to point out is that the people who make the wine are very important. And so I'm actually going to start a little discussion with Priyanka about her wine experience, her first wine experience. Many people in the wine business are there because they discovered wine at some point in their life. And it's a very strong attraction for them. Most of the people in the business are very passionate. So I want to start by asking Priyanka a little bit about how she got started in wine.
Hi everyone, thank you all for joining us here today. It's a very personal honor for me to actually be sitting next to Professor Waterhouse. He's one of the reasons I have continued to stay in the wine industry, so this is a very exciting time. So I was born and raised in Mumbai, India, and growing up, you know, I was very confused about what I wanted to do with my life. The usual three categories just did not make sense to me. I think a little bit of a background, my parents are both physicists, so my father's a scientist, my mother taught graduate level physics. So right off the bat, I think physics was out of the question. It wasn't anything I wanted to do. So I decided to pursue food engineering, and mainly because of the cross sciences. I loved microbiology and application-based sciences, and so the University of Chemical Technology in Mumbai was leading with this new program for food engineering. And I was relatively new. It was the time when General Mills and a lot of the bigger corporations, Nestle, was starting to take interest into manufacturing in India. So there was a lot of opportunity for growth, a lot of opportunity to really kind of carve a career for yourself. And some of our seniors took us to a field trip. They said, you know, we're going to teach you about what food engineering is. And so we started off with going to a production facility that made Parle biscuits, Parle-G biscuits, which everyone here is, I think, familiar with. And that was exciting, you know, you eat that every day, you want to see how it's made, but it was uniforms and hairnets and a lot of quality control, so I thought it was great, but it wasn't exciting. And then the next place we went to was the Amul dairy processing plant, again, you know, pretty well-known name. But the minute you step into a production facility with that much amount of milk, it's a very strong smell, so that was immediately cancelled out. And at this point, I'm a little disappointed, right? I'm thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Why have I chosen this field? And the last place we went to was Sula Vineyards, which was, at the time, one of the first winery in Nasik. Right now, probably the biggest volume producer for India. And it was harvest time, so the winery was clean, everything smelled great. You could smell fermentations going on. We finished our tour at the tasting room, which if anyone has visited, looks over the vineyards and then the lake. You know, they poured us some wine, even though by US standards I was not legally supposed to be drinking. And so we tasted all of this stuff, and I remember thinking, you know, this could be fun. Why not go into wine? And so that's kind of how the interest started. After that, it was a lot of learning and reading. Wine was up and coming in India at the time. You know, restaurants didn't have wines on the list. You could find them at alcohol shops, but there was no culture of drinking wine. And I kind of just one day, you know, decided to get into it. And my uncle, who was on the hotel industry and was seeing it up and coming from a consumer side, said if you're going to study it, you have to apply to UC Davis. And so because of him, I ended up applying to Davis, and I must have written something correct in that application form because I got accepted, which was very exciting, and that's how I came to the department.
I remember you said, you had a little story about how you had to convince your parents.
I mean, everyone in this room can understand when you go up to your parents, both physicists, and say, hi, I'm going to do wine. That's not the easiest. easiest conversation to have. Initially, my father was, he thought I was joking, so he said, "Wow, what will that mean for my retirement?" He was very excited. My sister actively likes beer, so she said, why wouldn't you think about beer making while wine? So it was a very mixed bag response. But then I was serious, and I was starting to get these acceptance letters to universities, and at that point my parents realized she's not joking, she's like genuinely interested. And then I applied for financial assistance, ended up getting a scholarship at Davis. So at this point there was literally nothing they could say. All I needed was a plane ticket. So they succumbed, and they allowed me to come to California to do this. And then my father had a conference in Washington, D.C. So I joined fall quarter, and he had a conference in Washington, D.C. January of the next year. And then he came out to Davis and saw the classrooms in Wixon Hall and the Robert Mondavi Institute. And back in the day we used to talk on Skype, and so I remember on Skype he told my mom, he goes, "It's a real science, it's an actual field, she's good, it's good."
Yeah, I think I'll just mention it's a wonderful career for a number of reasons. I mentioned the people who are in the business love it, and they're very passionate about it. So it's a great, it's a great career to work with other people who are so passionate about what they do. The other thing is, often you travel because wine is a global business. And what's cool is you get to travel to these wonderful places where they grow grapes, because grapes don't grow in Siberia, and they don't grow in the Sahara Desert. They grow in places like Chianti, in the south of France, and Argentina, and so on. Beautiful places. So it's wonderful, and we all enjoy traveling to visit those vineyards. So I think we're going to start with discussing a little bit about California vineyards, because I think we wanted to teach you a little bit about California wine. So one thing about wine is that the grapes take on different character depending on where they're grown. And some of the famous places that you've heard of, Burgundy, Bordeaux, Napa Valley, are famous because they have a very particular climate. And so I'm going to ask Priyanka to explain a little bit about the different vineyard areas of California.
So California is, as a state, is currently the largest volume producer when it comes to wine in the United States. I think at this point there is production in almost every state in the United States, but California is by far the largest producer, and there are many reasons for this. One, of course, is the diversity in terms of the different regions that are available in California. So if you start from the very north to the south, you have areas both on the coastal side, which means very close to the ocean. I think the closest vineyard is less than a mile from the ocean, so very strong influence when it comes to the sea breezes, the very cooler climate. And then as you move towards the interior of the state, you start to see a bigger diversity, not only in terms of soil, but also in terms of temperature. So you can go from warmer kind of valley areas, which are very rich soils, to higher mountain areas where you see a very kind of different expression in terms of the grapes. So when you go from the north to the south, because of these different pockets, if you will, of the different regions where we can grow grapes, the type of grapes that you choose to plant will also change. Those decisions are very much dependent on the producer. I think, overall there is definitely a consensus of which grape varieties do well in certain areas, so like cool climate versus warm climate, valley floor versus a mountainside. If you were to look at all of these different regions, there's a bit of a consensus, but sometimes some of the most exciting wines come when producers break those rules. So we have a little bit of that. One of the biggest reasons why quality grapes are so great in Napa is also temperature. And the biggest difference is because the high temperatures during the day compared to the very low temperatures at night. So that big cyclic shift that you see between daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures is what really, really influences the quality of grape varieties. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I think California is not only a leading wine region volume-wise, but also quality-wise for the country.
So we have selected wines here that come from different regions of California. So when we go through that, we'll be discussing where these different grapes come from. So one last question I have for Priyanka before we start tasting, which is, now you may have not realized, but all of these wines have connections with people from India. Either the owners of the companies are from India, or the winemakers are from India, like Priyanka is. So I was going to. We're not only tasting California, but California with a little twist. So is there some reason why we now have all these Indians coming to California to make wine? It seems, I don't recall in the past, I remember the very first Indian student we had was from the Grover family. Perhaps you've heard of that wine company in India. Came to our department some years before Priyanka did. And I really wasn't expecting another person from India, but now we're seeing, well, there are many. So what's going on?
Well, I think there are a couple of different reasons. I think one is, of course, Indians in the United States have overall done very well for themselves. We have a huge presence in especially the Silicon Valley, which is right next to Napa. And then even if you were to see other wine regions, there usually is a connection between investment and wine. So, there's a running joke in the industry that it takes a large fortune to make a small fortune in the wine industry. And so I think with how well Indians have been doing overall, there has been kind of that interest now into other fields. Simultaneously, I think a rise in the Indian wine industry itself back home has been a huge feature. So I remember when I left to come and study at Davis, as I said, there weren't a lot of restaurants that had wine lists or that people were actively thinking about wine tasting. And now when you go back, there's been a huge change in the culture in terms of wines. So you have sommeliers at restaurants. We now have our first Indian master of wine in the world. And so there's been a huge kind of a shift in terms of what is this category and let's see what we can do with it. What I'm really excited about for this tasting is a lot of these people whose wines have been represented, such a flight has never been curated before that I am aware of. So I'm excited because not only will you see in this flight a difference in the kind of grapes that are being used, but also in styles and regions as well. So I think when Indians decide to do something, we do it really well.
Well, I'm most excited to taste the very first one. This is, the brand is Ottavino, and it's from the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is a region which I would say is, generally speaking, quite cool. And the grape here is Gruner Veltliner, which is a grape that comes from Austria. It's not widely grown in the US. And actually, a few years ago, it was sort of one of those, fad grapes that, you go to the restaurants and they would have Gruner from Austria and be bragging about, we have Gruner, to taste. And now there have been a few more plantings in California and a few people are making it. So it was very exciting to me to find that we could actually get Gruner Veltliner for this tasting. So could you tell us a little bit about who's making it and where the grapes come from?
Yes, I'm very excited about the first wine. So the winemaker and owner for this brand, Ottavino, is Shalini Shekhar, who I'm very excited to also call a friend. And I'm going to read a little bit of a bio to do justice to everything that she has achieved as well. So Shalini was a former musician who had kind of graduated with a master's degree in flute and piccolo performance. She completed her studies at Fresno State in viticulture and enology, which is the study of grape growing and winemaking, and kind of started her journey into winemaking shortly after that. She has mainly been working with Pinot Noir, a type of grape variety, and has some significant experience when it comes to working with very well-known wineries like Copain, Luxome, and then Rohr Wines. In 2017, she started Otavino Wines and parallelly also started a consulting company. So she now consults for about 5 brands, and she's the winemaker for 3 of them, along with her own brand. What was really, really great is in 2019, she was nominated by San Francisco's Chronicle as winemaker to watch. In 2015, she was awarded a winemaker of the year for the San Francisco International Wine Competition for her work with a brand called Furthermore Pinot Noir. So Shalini's idea with all the kind of wines she wants to make are really interesting, exclusive wines. And if you look at the sheet that we have provided, there's a little bit of information in terms of alcohol percentage and what the production is. So for this wine, we have about 141 cases only that are being made. A case is usually a 12-bottle box. And so if you think about it, that's not a very significant production at all. And so she has about 6 different varieties that she makes under the Otavino label. And this is a very cool vineyard on higher altitude in Santa Cruz. It's located just under 4 miles from the ocean. So Gruner as a variety is naturally kind of very zesty, lime, floral, but with that ocean influence, you'll see a little bit more of that lemon, lime, citrus kind of flavors for it.
So, go ahead and taste. The procedure for tasting would be to first look carefully at the color of the wine, and you'll see that this is a light colored yellow, which is typical for a white wine. We never see a white wine as completely white. And then the second step in tasting would be to smell the wine. And you would get the aromas here from the grape, getting some citrus, not smelling any pepper, which I think Gruner normally has a little bit of a pepper aroma. Maybe some of you can smell that pepper. And then after you smell it, then you can put some in your mouth, okay? Now, if this were a professional tasting, we'd have a little cup next to the glass. What would that be for? Yes. We're not asking you to do that tonight. This is not a professional tasting. You have to swallow. Yes, sir.
How do you make sure that you get the full flavor of the wine? Is it, wine is one thing you sip and it goes to your throat and you concentrate. I see you like kind of swirling your, how do you know which part of the tongue is basically the tongue?
Well, okay, so when you're doing technical tasting, you can normally, we do it in a rather, conventionally rude tasting manner. You would put some in your mouth. And you inhale air across the wine in order to get a full flavor of the wine. Now, one of the reasons that works is that when the wine is in the back of your throat, it evaporates the aromas back up into your nose. It's called retronasal smelling. So when you're tasting something in your mouth, the complexity of the aromas are actually from the smell. Your tongue is very blunt. It tastes only a few things: sweetness, tartness, bitterness, and saltiness. And we can smell literally thousands of different things. So the complexity that we taste when we're tasting wine is actually from the smell. So you want to get the wine into your mouth and then evaporate some so that you can smell it as well.
I get a little salty taste in this one.
Yes, I love that comment because that is definitely that marine influence that you're seeing. This vineyard in Santa Cruz also has very sandy soils, which means if you look at the composition of the soil, there's a little bit more of the sand content. And usually when there's a little bit more of sand and limestone, the grapes tend to express themselves in a little bit more of that saltiness. Another reason why you would get that is the winemaking style. So Shalini, basically, when she's fermenting this, she's not looking for a lot of other influence. So there's not a lot of oak aging, for example, which is a stylistic preference, but it adds to the complexity. It changes a little bit how you perceive the grapes. So she ferments this very clean in stainless steel to really just allow the grape to shine through. A lot of that, when you keep it that kind of unfiltered approach, you always see that expression. And with Gruner, with it automatically being a little bit more on the acid, that saltiness is perceived a little bit, more easily compared to other wines that maybe have oak influence. So I'll go ahead and introduce our next wine because that is mine. So our next one is the 2019 Seta from Signorello Estate, which is where I'm the winemaker. 2019 was my first very vintage as head winemaker at this estate, so I was excited to bring that very first bottle to you. This wine is not a single variety. So the first wine that we tasted, when we said Gruner Veltliner, that means 100% of the wine has been made by the grapes of Gruner Veltliner. For the Seta, we use two different grapes, Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. Both are separate white wine varieties, and the final blend that goes in the bottle is a 50-50 percentage between the two grapes. One of the reasons to do this is if you were to taste any of the classic white wines from Bordeaux, Bordeaux Blanc, which is a white wine from Bordeaux, usually has the same combination of grapes, Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, but in a very different percentage. It's usually much more Sauvignon heavy, so about 80 to 20% or 90 to 10%. So the idea was to do a little bit of spin on that traditional Bordeaux style by making it a 50-50 blend. Semillon is also a grape variety that has very good ageability, which is something you don't really talk about with white wines. Usually with white wines, they go drink it now and then buy another bottle if you want more, right? But there are some white varieties that age beautifully and you see a very different expression if you have a little bit more patience. And so with the Seta, we want that ageability factor to come in, which is why we're using a heavier percentage of Semillon. A little bit different style compared to the Gruner. This one is more creamier, it's a little bit richer. A lot of that is to do with the fact that we use barrels for fermentation. So it's 100% fermented in the oak wooden barrels, fermented and aged. And then we don't add any yeast. So usually if you were to go to a winery, the process of fermentation involves the addition of commercial yeasts to conduct that fermentation process. Because these are estate vineyards, we allow the fermentation to happen naturally. So because of that, you get a little bit more complexity and a little bit more, in my opinion, genuine expression of where the grapes are coming from. Oh, please taste.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned about estate wine. I mean, for those like us, how is that different from a non-estate wine in terms of adding estate to
So all wines technically have yeast, right? Because that is what conducts the fermentation process. In terms of inoculated versus native, which is what I'm talking about, that talks about the origin of where the yeast is coming from. So a commercial yeast would basically come, as a packet, kind of like a yeast you would use if you were baking bread or if you were making yogurt. And though these commercial yeasts have been studied and researched and trialed and tested, so there's a level of reliability of how your fermentation will turn out. A lot of producers that use commercial yeasts are either purchasing grapes from other vineyards that they're not farming themselves, or they're maybe making wines in a facility that is not their own, or it could be for a number of other stylistic reasons as well, or they're in a hurry. But if you look at the really classic producers of wine across the world, the idea of what is called terroir, which is where is this grape coming from and who is making it and how is it being made, a lot of that comes from the natural yeast that is present in the vineyard. And so that is what we are doing with Signorello estate wines.
So in any facility, you develop a culture of yeast in the facility, which is fairly consistent. So you get a sort of a house flavor from the yeast that grows there. And it changes very slowly over time, but it is very, it produces a flavor imprint on the wine.
So what's the impact of aging that you talked about aging in the barrel?
So the decision to age in a barrel is up to the producer. So it kind of comes, it becomes a question of how long do you want to do that for. Traditionally, white wines are usually aged for anywhere between 8 to 14 months, but not more than that, because whites are generally a little more delicate. The aromatics are, those are things you can lose easily, so you usually want to put it in bottle earlier. Bottle aging is where things change. So for example, a young white wine if you're opening it, soon after it's been bottled, you'll get a little bit more of, big like lemon, lime, bright pineapple, peach, just very, very aromatic, very fruity or floral depending on the grape variety. But as they age, white wines usually start to become a little bit, the color changes, they'll become more golden, for example. And you'll start to see flavor profiles changing. So you'll get a little bit more of like a honey or an apricot jam or a walnut or more nutty kind of finish at the end. So that's when you really start diving deep into wines, that's when it gets fun. So you can start with, a lot of people will buy more than one bottle and then open it at different intervals just to see how they will enjoy it.
It does not leave a aftertaste. So I wanted to understand this, is it linked with the grape, variety of the grape, or the process to make the wine? It does not leave a long aftertaste. So does the aftertaste depends on the variety of the grape or the process to make the wine?
That actually both of those things. The grape, because the grape imparts different characters depending on the variety, but then the processing is very important, especially if you age the wine in barrel or not. That completely changes what's called the mouthfeel of the wine, which comes from the aging, basically what's called yeast autolysis. So as the wine ages in barrel, the yeast which are in the barrel basically fall apart and release the material substances into the wine, which completely changes the balance. But that step is extremely important in changing the taste.
Can we toast to our wonderful wine? Here we go. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
The aging process, from red to wine, several of the, for example, outside, they claim that they do not release anything that is aged less than 25 hours. Now, is there a limit to the aging after which, beyond that point, the aging doesn't make any difference to taste?
This is the perfect question for Professor Waterhouse because a significant amount of his research is focused exactly on this question.
So the question was, does wine actually decline with age after some point? And it definitely does. Actually, I'd be surprised if Lafite actually waits 25 years. Maybe they wait 5 years, but the cash flow problems would be very severe if they waited 25 years before releasing the wines. Generally speaking, with wines, the wines most famous for aging are wines from Bordeaux in France, because of the grapes and the style of the winemaking. And those wines actually can be excellent between 10 and 30 years. Depends on the vintage. There's some variability depending on what year the wines were made. When you get to 50 years, then even with the most famous wines, things can go down, for sure. And so then, and there's also problems with the bottle itself. The corks often start to break down after 30 years. So there's a lot of issues with really old bottles. But you can, I have had 50-year-old wines which were quite drinkable. I've also had 50-year-old wines which were not.
You mentioned about Bordeaux and certainly the Rhine Valley, in addition to Napa and other places. You did not mention. I had the pleasure of visiting all the wineries as a guest of the ambassador, US ambassador in Chile, the wine country. Excellent wines. Australia, another area I traveled through the wine country in Australia. Excellent wine. You didn't mention any of those. What is your opinion about the quality of those wines? Chile and Australia.
There are many countries. So Chile and Argentina are both making excellent wines, as well as South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. I could go on. There's many countries in Europe. I would say that 30 or so years ago, there were many places that were not making serious wine, but that has changed across the board. Now, there are even countries which were in the Soviet Union which were really making only industrial, well, even calling it wine would be questionable, but now they're making excellent products. And so I think really, if you're a wine drinker, today's a wonderful time to be a wine drinker because you have so many options of fabulous wine. We have a question way over there.
Yeah, my question is, when you have red wine, when you uncork it, right? I mean, I hear from people saying you have to oxidize for a certain amount, then you pour it in glass, all kinds of things, and then you can finish it. Let's say in the fridge or outside, what's the actual?
We like to complicate things. I think sometimes when we talk to consumers, there's a couple of different ways to think about it. Usually when you're asking someone to oxidize the wine or decant the wine for reds, those are things that are really add value to heavy reds. So anything like a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Syrah. And the reason that you want to do that is because the more oxygen the wine gets, the nuances of what you're smelling in the in the glass, and how you're perceiving the wine also changes. Professor Waterhouse can talk about tannins in wine at a much deeper level of expertise than I can, but the tannins that are naturally present in red wines also significantly undergo a chemical change when exposed to oxygen. So that's one of the reasons why it is suggested that you should open your bottle and decant it. There are some wines though that are made for immediate consumption that usually don't require it. The mouthfeel, the way the wine has been processed is for someone to be able to open a bottle and start enjoying it right away. I would say when it comes to the decision of to do it or not to do it, it's a very personal one, and it comes with drinking more wines. So as you drink more wines and you drink the first glass, and then you start to drink the next glass, maybe 15-20 minutes afterwards, enjoy another one. If you enjoy that progression, then maybe that's something you should do. If you are not able to perceive a significant difference, then just enjoy the wine. When it comes to can you leave a bottle open, this is a big question my father also has, because he always goes, but if I open a bottle of wine, I have to drink it. And the truth is that you usually do have a little bit of time. Sometimes with a white, maybe I may not suggest it, but if you were to buy some of the newer seals that you can now get, you can get these vacuum seals that you can replace the top of the bottle, put it in the fridge. They're usually fine to enjoy even a week after. With reds, you sometimes have a little bit more time, but if you are going to sit on a partial bottle of wine, I would very much suggest investing in those vacuum sealers.
Brenda, first of all, you're so cool, and I really love that we're doing for them. For the whites, I wanted to ask, how would it change if they were chilled? Or are these wines that are meant to be added?
They were chilled when we started. Usually the colder the wine, the easier it is to perceive any defects in the wine, which is something which kind of comes more on the professional side. I think with whites, having them colder allows that perception of acidity to come through a lot nicer, so they're a little more refreshing, they're a little more easier to drink. When we professionally evaluate wines, we actually allow them to come a little bit more to temperature, because with temperature you will see a little bit more of those aromatics come out. So yes, ideally I would have liked these two wines to be a little colder than they are, but in our defense they were when we started out.
Question back there.
How important is vintage when buying a wine?
That's a very good question.
That's a very good question. So the question was, how important is vintage, or the year the wine was made? It's actually the year the grapes were grown. And in the old days, like in the distant past, it was extremely important because we didn't have the technology available. And when we had good grapes, we made great wine. When we had bad grapes, we made bad wine. And people lived with it. So when they talk about a good vintage in historical documents, they're talking about a fantastic event for them. Nowadays, we have a lot of technology that allows us to correct problems of vintage. In other words, sometimes if you have a lot of rain, well, it almost never happens in California, but it does happen occasionally. You get more mold on the grapes, and that reduces the quality. So depending on the vintage, the temperatures of that year, how quickly the grapes ripen in California, this is an issue, then the quality does change, but not very much. In other words, in California, we like to say we have a good vintage every year. There's a few years which are off a bit. I would say in certain European countries, they're more sensitive to that because they have a climate which maybe they can't actually get the grapes to ripen properly because it's too cool. In 10 years that'll change, but anyway, for now, they're having problems getting the grapes ripen in certain years, so there is a vintage variation. But in California, it's not as serious a problem. For instance, in 2011, we had a very wet harvest period. Were you working that year?
No, I was in Burgundy.
Every winemaker I knew said it was the worst vintage of their entire career because we don't know how to deal with rain during the harvest period here. It almost never happens. That year, I remember seeing on Facebook all these posts, thank God the vintage is over. Now, some of those wines are showing really well. So even when it's a bad vintage in California, maybe we can still recover. So, but if you look at the traditional Northern European areas, the vintage can have a huge effect. Like especially like in Germany, the Mosel area, the vintage variation is really quite significant. Okay, sulfites is on the bottle, so it must be dangerous, right? Okay, so there's a few thousand people in the United States who have a genetic defect that prevents them from breaking down sulfites. In your body, every day, you produce about 800 milligrams of sulfites. It's a natural result of protein metabolism. So in your body, every cell has an enzyme called sulfite oxidase, which breaks down sulfites. In a glass of wine, we probably find about 3 or 4 milligrams of sulfites. So you can imagine if your body's used to processing 800 milligrams a day, that a few milligrams from a glass of wine is really not an issue. Now, there are some foods which have very high levels of sulfites, and people aren't so worried about that, but all foods with sulfites are labeled because the people who have this genetic defect need to be informed that the food contains sulfites. For them, their body is constantly struggling to get rid of the sulfites. So any extra sulfites from food is a problem. So that's why the label exists. So for most of us, sulfites are really not a problem. Now there are other things in wine which may give reactions, and I can discuss that later, but it's not the sulfites. So I think people, they have a reaction to wine and they think it must be the sulfites because it's on the label. But it's most likely something else. So that's my spiel. Get off the sulfites.
But in terms of why we use it, it is to preserve the wine. But to Professor Waterhouse's point, if you were to look at the actual quantity that was being used, it usually is not a significant amount. And I would say with technology getting better and better, producers are realizing that we don't even need to use the amounts that were traditionally being used. So it's definitely, I mean, if you were to look at from the 80s to the early 2000s, I would say producers were probably using significantly higher amounts of sulfite to preserve their wines. And over the last decade, there is a huge trend in the industry to see what's that level that we can absolutely go down to. Okay, we'll get back to some of those other questions, but let's get to wine 3 because temperature is everything here. So we have a rosé of Pinot Noir, again by a fabulous producer. This is Naidu Family Wines. And Ragini and Kaushik Naidu that own and operate this winery are two very wonderful people. So Ragini was born and raised in the state of Punjab, and then she moved to Melbourne, which is where she met her husband Kaushik, who is from the state of Chennai. They were both studying there. Over their life, they had an opportunity to live in different parts of the world because of Kaushik's career as an IT engineer and kind of fell in love with wine along the way. In 2006, they moved to San Francisco and they've been in the Bay Area ever since. So Ragini decided, especially once she was closer to this region of Sonoma, that she absolutely fell in love with wine, and with Kaushik's help in 2019, they acquired an awesome Pinot Noir vineyard in Sonoma Coast that coincidentally was also being farmed by a second-generation Indian American family. So she now makes 3 different wines. The Rosé of Pinot is her highest case production at 70 cases, so it's definitely a very small boutique operation. But she's starting to see really great success when it comes to representation in a lot of the restaurants and wine lists in Sonoma State. So a Rosé of Pinot Noir is usually a red variety. It's definitely a lighter style wine, but it's also very commonly used as a rosé wine. And if we were to go into what is a rosé wine, usually the color of a wine comes by the amount of time that you allow the skins of the grapes to interact with the juice. So in a traditional red wine, or let's actually start from the beginning, with white wines, you press the juice off of the skins. So white wines traditionally do not see a lot of contact when it comes to skins versus juice. With red wines, you ferment them on the skins up to the very end, and we'll get to what those decisions mean here when we get to the next 2 wines. But with a rosé of Pinot, you would basically allow that skin contact for anywhere between 2 to 12 hours, just enough to get the color that you're looking for. And the minute you achieve the color, you would press it just like a white wine and then ferment it like a white wine. So rosé is currently the largest growing category of wines across the United States. People have started to appreciate it for its refreshing flavors and more important flexibility. You can drink a rosé in the summer, you can enjoy it in the winter, and it really kind of fits between both of the 2 wines. And Ragini's style is very fruit forward, so a lot of strawberry, a lot of really fun, cherry and jam kind of aromatics on it. So please enjoy.
So I did want to mention that rosé can be made from almost any red grape. Pinot Noir is one of the traditional ones because it makes a very nice Pinot Noir. A very nice rosé. This particular wine is made deliberately as a rosé. Sometimes rosés are made as sort of a byproduct of making a red wine. We do a process called saignée, where you harvest the grapes and then you put the wine in tank. You drain off a little bit of the juice in order to increase the concentration of tannin and color in the balance of the wine. But this wine is made deliberately as a rosé. And so it was harvested earlier, which gives it extra crispness. So in a rosé, one of the things I look for, which this wine has, is a tartness, which is similar to white wine, and not softness like you would get in a red wine.
What's the outlet? Outlook. Oh, I think it's quite positive actually. Traditionally, grape growing and winemaking was mainly in the state of Maharashtra, so around the Nasik area was kind of the birthplace. Right after that, it saw a significant growth a little bit south, so in the about 90 to 100 kilometers out of Bangalore was kind of the second region that really started up and coming. In the last 5 years, we've seen a significant amount of interest from foreign corporations. So Moet Hennessy, which is one of the world's largest sparkling wine producers, just developed about 200 hectares of land in Himachal Pradesh. We've had a couple of other companies come in. There's a couple from Sonoma that are now starting to make wine in and around India. And the most exciting thing about India has historically been making fruit wines longer than any region, So we've had cherry wines and plum wines in that Himachal area that have existed long before traditional grape wines kind of came into the picture. So I think there's definitely promise for what the industry can be, and the governments are doing a lot to protect and encourage the growth of the domestic market. So currently there is anywhere between a 200 to 250% import tax, so that makes any imported wines pretty expensive, and the idea behind that is to encourage consumers to support the domestic industry.
It's good to know that other fruits are also used for making wine. That was my next question actually, you already answered.
Yeah.
So are they competing grapes and other fruits making wine? Grapes is the major fruit that is used for making wine.
For classic wine, if you're looking at the definition of wine, it is 100% from grapes. There is a specification on the type of grapes. Usually they belong to the family of Vitis vinifera, so like a table grape variety. Although there have been trials and all kinds of studies of what are the different types of grapes we can use to make wine, what are maybe the specific characteristics or things that we like or do not like about some of the alternate grape varieties. Traditionally, wine is defined as made from grapes. So if you're making wine from any other fruit, it is defined as a fruit wine. So then you'd have to specify the name of the fruit.
So what's the economics of winemaking? You told about a night with 70 cases, right? And so how big the land? That's only $25,000, right? So I'm wondering.
If you would like to start a wine brand. Well, I said it earlier, it takes a large fortune. Oh, well, we should talk. Winemaking is definitely, the thing about winemaking is it's an industry of passion, right? So you can really decide the volume, the level, the grape variety, the style, depending on what you truly enjoy. If you're looking into making it a lucrative business, then it really requires a lot of thought and planning and incentive and marketing and communications, and then we're in a whole other wheelhouse. But
No. You will not make a lot of money making wine.
yes.
You can make a good living, but you will not. If you really are concerned about making money, don't get into wine.
Long story short. Yeah. You are speaking to my heart right now. Yes. No, traditionally, the question is there Indian food and wine pairings? So traditionally, and this is my biggest issue with the wine industry currently, is that we have kept the experience of wine very limited. So usually you walk into a wine tasting room, doesn't matter which part of the world you're in, they're traditionally always paired with more European style cuisines, right? And even the concepts when we talk about food and wine pairing, like I went to a restaurant in India and he was talking about how this food pairs really well with poached salmon, and poached salmon wasn't even on the menu. So when you start to talk about wine like that, it gets a little isolating in my opinion, and it's very exciting for me now. Just the newer generation of chefs that are coming in really start to explore those boundaries. And so I think there are some fantastic pairings that you can have with food and wine. And with Indian food, in general, there is such a large misconception that Indian food is rich and spicy and oily, which is true for some dishes, but Indian cuisine overall is probably one of the most nuanced cuisines in the world that is still to be that is still unexplored, in my opinion. So I've hosted a couple of food and wine pairings, and we've had tremendous success with it. If I have to give a quick couple of pointers, anything that's acidic, so if you're doing white wines and you're pairing them with yogurt-based marinades, so like tandoori chicken and dry Riesling is probably the way to get to my heart. If you have something spicier, so if you're doing like a curry that has maybe a little bit more of a depth when it comes to spice and flavors and levels of those flavors, you probably want to pair it with a little bit of a spicier wine, so something like a Malbec or a Syrah that will stand up to the kind of intensity of flavors that you're tasting. If you were to look at traditional like Goan cuisine that has a lot of coconut, there are some great varieties that have that in them and they complement each other very nicely. So it's something that hasn't quite been explored, but there are some really great classic pairings that hopefully when Signorello is up and running, you can come and test it.
I'm looking forward to the
Dinner.
book. No.
Okay, so let's, I know there are a lot of questions, but let's get to wine 4 because Prasant is doing this, which means we have to keep going. So wine 4, again, a wonderful couple that makes this wine. This one from a region point of view, so with the first wine we went to the Santa Cruz Mountains, with the second one we were in Napa Valley, which I call home currently. With the third wine we went to Sonoma Coast, and with the fourth wine, the Apsara Cabernet Sauvignon, we're coming back into Napa Valley, but we're going to the very heart of Napa, so the very northern point of St. Helena, which is the birthplace of wine. So Apsara Cellars is owned by Anita and Robin, that met 20 years ago in the jungles of Indonesia when they were studying biology and environmental science. In 2018, they moved to Petaluma, where they both fell in love with wine. So Anita has a history of filmmaking and storytelling, and so she uses that when it comes to telling the story of this brand. And her husband, Robin, is mainly involved when it comes to the winemaking of this. What's really exciting for me for this wine is if you notice the vintage, this is a 2015. So this is definitely the wine with the most age in this current flight that we have. And when you think about St. Helena and Napa, you're thinking about probably some of the richest wines to come out of Napa Valley when it comes to heavier wines. So there'll be a lot more complexity on this wine and a longer finish because of that oak age. This one sees about 18 months of age before it goes into bottle. So someone asked a question about the finish and the length of the wine. This one will definitely be the wine that will give you a lot of that.
So given the same location or the same kind of grapes for a casual wine drinker, what are your tips to pick the correct wine? Suppose you are picking from a store, how would you know that because all the Napa Valley, all the same locations, same weather, mostly they are processed in the same plants. So how would you know the quality? Like what makes it different than wine A versus wine B?
Drink and learn. Sometimes wine stores have scores on them. So usually there's probably 3 main programs when it comes to scoring wines between Wine Spectator, Wine Advocate, and Wine Enthusiast. So when you have those scores on display, usually if there is a wine that's marked 90 and over, that's a pretty significantly good quality. I don't believe necessarily that those scores reflect the true authenticity of a wine, but they're definitely a good place to start when it comes to knowing about wines. The second thing is, as you drink a wine, see what you actually like about it. Did you like the grape variety, or did you, if you've now been tasting, say, Chardonnay from Napa and you've liked every wine so far, maybe that's something that you enjoy for your palate. Maybe you've tasted Chardonnay from Napa and then you tasted it from Australia and you preferred the one from Australia, well, then that gives you a direction of how next to explore. So I get this question all the time. I get pictures in supermarkets going, which wine should I buy? And it's kind of like shopping for clothes. You know, you figure it out as you buy more and more. But the best way to learn is to keep trying and kind of keep a record of what you're trying. And I know Professor Waterhouse wants to say something.
Yeah, so the scores are interesting, but they reflect a person's or a company's judgment with regard to some standard. So for instance, Robert Parker is a very famous wine judge, writer, and he preferred very rich, lush wines. Now there's a trend, a welcome trend in my opinion, making wines which are called leaner and crisper. And those are much better when consumed with food. So if Robert Parker gave a wine a very high score, I would be suspicious about buying it because his reference point is a style that I don't like. So the single scores are very difficult to work with unless you understand the standard behind the score. Okay, and like I said, today a lot of winemakers are making wines which are different from the wine style he would have preferred.
We have a lot of questions. I know the gentleman over there has been. The question is, what goes well with biryani? Is it chicken biryani, mutton biryani, fish biryani, goat meat biryani? So now my mouth is watering. Syrah is, and the last wine that we have on the flight would probably be an excellent accompaniment to biryani. In some cases, you know, a creamier rosé really helps with biryani as well because biryani is rich and can be, you know, a little bit more fatty. So a nice acidic wine that still has some fruit on it really helps to cut through and balance out really nicely with the biryani. Malbecs from Argentina, probably an excellent pairing for biryani as well. I would start off with 3 different wines and see which one you like with your biryani and keep going from there. So, sorry, I have one question.
So how it is very expensive versus expensive versus good wine? Is it like all expensive wines are good or is not?
Now we're stirring the pot. The question is it all expensive wines are good, or what is the difference between good or cost-wise? How do you define wine? So usually, you know, you would assume that the more expensive a wine, the better it is. Cost, however, can come because of many different reasons. So like in a place like California, for example, where the cost of land is high, the cost of labor is high, the cost of growing grapes, of materials, of processing, you know, everything is high. It's difficult to, in Napa Valley, for example, it's difficult to have cheap wines, right? Because there's just no way to economically make that work. So in that case, usually you would think the more expensive wine, the better it is. I would say it really comes down to producers. Some producers excel at what they do, in which case the cost of the wine is because of the brand and the reputation of the brand. And as you get to know those classic producers, you can be assured that you're spending money for the right reason. I wouldn't go off the bat and say all expensive wines are good. So there's a little bit of...
Is the Vivino app is the right one to track?
Which one?
Vivino.
Vivino is a very good app to track. There are some other apps, Cellar Tracker is another one, where you can use everyone's palate. So it's not just about what the app recommends to you, it's based on how many other people rate the wine as well. So yeah, there are some really great ones. Before we get to the last few questions, can I introduce the last wine? Because, okay. Let me get to the last wine. Okay, so the last wine is all the way kind of going further south of California. We're now in Paso Robles in the central coast of California. Copia Vineyards is one of my favorite producers out of Paso Robles overall. And the couple that has started and founded Copia is Varinder and Anita Sahi. So Varinder grew up in the Delhi area, Anita Sahi grew up mainly in Mumbai, and they met years later in Chicago when they were both working there together. Over time, they lived between New York City and Chicago, and then came to Paso Robles in 2013, where they completely fell in love with the region there. Since then, they have founded Copia Vineyards, which is a 50-acre property. It's currently the, in my opinion, best designed winery in Napa. So they've built a winery, developed an estate, and host some of the best experiences when it comes to Paso Robles. So they have about 20 acres planted in this area, and then they also have a tasting room in downtown Paso Robles. So Syrah is a great variety that definitely does well in Paso. Paso is probably the warmest region when it comes to the different regions of California that we've tasted, and Syrah thrives in warm weather. So you'll see a lot more of the spice notes compared to Cabernet on there. There's more pepper, there's a little bit more cumin, there's definitely more of that cherry jam, plum kind of aromas, and that makes it pair better with the goat biryani that we're
May I ask the question?
Yes.
Sorry. So two things, since you introduced the other one. First I want to know what I like the most about the fourth wine is the dryness. So why does it get that dry? Like when I put it in mouth and drink it, it almost dries out in my mouth, right? How does
For
that
port wine or red wine?
The red wine.
For the red wine.
Yeah, the
So the question is, what I love about red wine is when I taste it, I get the dryness, and that is the perfect door to talk about tannins, which is the hallmark of Professor Waterhouse's research.
So the tannin, what you're tasting there is in fact not really technically in the sensory world a taste, but a physical sensation in the mouth. And it's due to the, what we call astringency. So tannin, what it does is it removes the lubrication of the saliva. So in your saliva you have proteins which provide lubrication, and the tannin extra removes it. So it produces an effect in the mouth, which we call dryness. And if you want a standard, have you ever had a persimmon that is not quite right? You will have that's like the standard of astringency. Sometimes I bring that to class and the students are all like, whoa, what happened? Yes. So gentlemen, way in the back there.
You said rosé comes from a red grape. So where does the actual color come from?
So the question is, rosé comes from red grapes, but where does the actual color come from? And that's from the skin. So what differentiates a red grape, which if you were to see it in the vineyard looks more like a black grape, compared to white grapes, which are green, is that the color compounds, which are called anthocyanins, exist in the skin of the red grape varieties. So with a rosé, you're kind of, it's almost like chai. If you keep the tea bag in water for longer, you'll get more extraction. So it's the same thing with skins and juice when it comes to red wine. So with rosé, it's a very short period of contact, and with red wines, it's a longer period of contact.
Okay, so is red wine really good for heart? My wife is
The question is red wine really good for your heart?
I think we're going to have to wrap this up and we'll answer your question.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay, no. This is a question for the So how often do you have wine tasting in your classes?
Okay.
He retired as of yesterday.
So, about 10 years ago, we had the state of California pass a law so that our students who are under 21 can taste wine in class. Good job. Now, in about half the classes, they taste wine. Yes. We don't taste wine in the wine analysis class because it's a laboratory experiment. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Andy and Priyanka. Couple quick comments, Priyanka. We do have goat meat for dinner tonight. And for those of you who still want more wine, just talk to me offline.